Spring 1865, Texas Hill Country. 2 weeks after the war's conclusion, dawn struggled to pierce the thick canopy overhead, sending scattered beams of pale light through the cottonwood branches. The creek whispered its ancient song, dancing around moss-slicked rocks and autumn's forgotten debris. Peace should have reigned here, yet something sinister lurked in the morning stillness that made Elias Gray's spine prickle with unease. His weary mount, a battle-worn gelding called Rufus, had suddenly halted beside the water's edge. The horse's ears stood alert, nostrils flared, breathing rapid and shallow. Elias swung down from the saddle with deliberate care, his palm instinctively finding the grip of his sidearm. His worn boots pressed deep into the soft, damp soil as he approached the gurgling stream. That's when he discovered her, a young woman, scarcely beyond girlhood, crumpled like discarded cloth near the water's edge. One limb was folded unnaturally beneath her frame, the other exposed from mid-thigh downward. Her torn garment was stained with earth and crimson, her palms raw as though she'd crawled through thorns to reach this place. Elias knelt beside her. Still form. "Ma'am," his voice barely above a breath. Silence answered him. He leaned closer, searching for signs of life. Her chest moved in shallow, labored waves. Her skin felt cold and clammy beneath layers of grime, and a deep gash carved across her thigh, vivid and weeping. His eyes swept the surrounding forest. Only birdsong and rustling leaves met his vigilance. "I mean you no harm," he murmured to her unconscious form. "Just need to tend this bleeding." From his saddlebag, he retrieved clean cloth, tearing it in two. Moving with infinite care to avoid startling her, he reached toward her injured leg. But the moment his fingers brushed the fabric of her skirt, her body convulsed violently. Her eyes flew open wide, wild, haunted. "Stop," she cried, her voice cracking like dry wood. "Please, just end it quickly." Elias froze, his hand suspended inches from her trembling form. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, he glimpsed something otherworldly in her expression, a brokenness beyond human words. This wasn't mere terror. This was surrender. "I'm here to help, not harm," he said with quiet conviction. "Just finish it," she breathed. "I can't bear to feel any more." He blinked hard. Slowly withdrawing his hand, he spoke with gentle firmness. "Nobody's dying on my watch today. You're wounded. I'm going to patch you up. Nothing more." She watched him, trembling like a trapped deer. Moving with extreme caution, he approached her injury again. "Let me see this wound," he said softly. "It needs proper care." This time she didn't resist, though her jaw clenched tight and she turned her face away. With infinite gentleness, he lifted the shredded fabric above her knee and his blood turned to ice. There, burned deep into the tender flesh of her inner thigh, was a brand. A single word, angry and permanent, seared into her skin. Elias felt his stomach lurch. He'd witnessed such markings once before, near war's end, when his unit had stumbled upon an improvised prison camp outside Monroe. Women mainly, some breathing, others not, all bearing identical marks. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. Looking at the girl again, he noticed she wasn't weeping. She wasn't even blinking. Her face had gone completely blank, like curtains drawn tight against daylight. "What should I call you?" he asked gently. She remained mute. "I'm Elias. Elias Gray. You're under my protection now." Still nothing. He bound the cloth around her thigh with careful precision, mindful of every wince. Blood saturated the fabric quickly, but pressure would stem the flow. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he promised. The girl made no reply. Her eyelids drifted closed again, too exhausted for further struggle. Elias wrapped his coat around her small frame and gathered her carefully into his arms. "Whatever horrors they inflicted," he whispered as he carried her toward Rufus, "they end this moment." As he rode away from the creek, the scar beneath her dress burned crimson in the morning light, silent witness to a story just beginning to unfold. The small dwelling sat half concealed beneath gnarled oaks just past the river's bend. Weathered and slightly listing eastward, it wasn't much to look at, but it offered dryness, shelter, and most importantly, safety. Elias carried the girl across the threshold and lowered her gently onto the bedroll near the cold hearth. While she'd been unconscious, the fire had died to ash, but he worked quickly, stacking kindling and striking flint. Soon flames began breathing warmth back into the humble space. She hadn't uttered another word since the creek. Her body lay motionless, lips colorless, eyes open but seeing nothing. A wild animal might flinch less than she did when he approached with warm water and clean rags. "This wound needs cleaning," he said softly. "It's going to hurt, the barest." Not almost imperceptible. He worked in complete silence, dabbing with infinite care, never meeting her gaze when the skirt had to be lifted, never touching beyond necessity. When finished, he drew the blanket over her legs again and stepped away. She continued watching him, not with interest, only wariness. A hunted creature, uncertain whether this new cage held nourishment or a blade, he moved to the stove, heated a pot of beans with a pinch of salt, then ladled some into a tin bowl. After letting it cool, he offered her the first spoonful. She stared without taking it. "Eat slowly," he said, his tone low and encouraging rather than commanding. Finally, she parted her lips. He fed her each bite as a father might feed an injured child. No conversation, no questions, just sustenance, warmth, firelight. That evening, he slept in the distant corner, back pressed to the wall, weapon within easy reach. She didn't stir once, but her eyes remained open far into the darkness. By dawn, she was sitting upright, leaning against the bedpost. When he brought water for washing her hands, she flinched initially, then allowed him to pour. On the third day, Elias sat beside her holding an old comb. "If you'll permit it, I can untangle that mess of yours." She hesitated, then slowly turned away from him. He began at the ends, working with infinite patience, careful never to pull. Her hair was matted with twigs, dried blood, and days of accumulated dust. He worked quietly, methodically, as the fire crackled nearby. Halfway through, she released a long breath, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped just slightly. Later that afternoon, he retrieved a small oval mirror from his pack, scratched and dented, the kind of keepsake a soldier might carry for memory's sake. He placed it on the stool beside her. "Perhaps you'd like to see. You look better than you might think." She stared at the mirror for a long moment. Then, in one sudden motion, she seized it and hurled it against the stone hearth. Glass scattered across the floor. Elias didn't move. Her voice emerged, barely audible. "I don't want to see her." He nodded slowly. "I understand." No lecture demanded, no apology required, just quiet acceptance. That evening, as he was ladling more beans into their bowls, she finally spoke again. "My name is Maeve." He looked over. "Maeve," he repeated like a sacred word. "That's all I can offer. Right now, that's more than I expected." She managed something between a sigh and a laugh. They ate in silence, but something had shifted, not in the room, but in the space between them. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask for gratitude. But when she handed back the empty bowl, her fingers brushed his for just a moment, and she didn't pull away. The road into Bandera stretched quiet that morning, bordered by cedar brush and dust still damp from overnight rain. Elias rode at an easy pace, Maeve seated behind him, arms loosely circling his waist. She'd spoken little since leaving the cabin, only nodding when he asked if she felt strong enough for the journey. They needed medical supplies. Her wound, though improving, still throbbed, and Elias knew infection could take hold without proper salve and fresh bandages. Bandera was a town barely clinging to life, warped planks, shuttered drinking establishments, and weary men carrying the war's weight on their shoulders. The kind of place where strangers drew stares and gossip stuck like burrs to wool. They dismounted near the general store. Elias helped Maeve down with gentle care. "Stay close to the horse," he instructed. "I'll be quick." She nodded, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The moment he disappeared into the store, her hands began trembling. She kept her gaze downcast, scanning every passerby with nervous glances. Then he materialized, a man half drunk, stumbling from the saloon. Thick-armed, greasy beard, eyes like black coal, breath reeking of decay. He bumped hard into her shoulder. "Mind where you're going," she muttered under her breath. He wheeled around, squinted, and looked her up and down with growing recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he slurred. "Ain't you a familiar little harlot?" Maeve stepped backward, but he moved closer. "You don't remember me?" he hissed. "Camp east of Monroe." "Oh, I remember that brand." He lunged forward and yanked at the edge of her skirt. In the harsh daylight, the word burned into her thigh, gleamed crimson and raw. Gasps rose from onlookers. One woman shielded her child's eyes. Someone whispered, "That's one of them." The man grinned wide. "Runaway property." Maeve froze solid, but Elias was already there, shoving the drunk so hard he stumbled backward into the watering trough. Before the man could rise, Elias struck him once, twice, a third time until blood poured from his nose. No one intervened. Elias grasped Maeve's hand. "We're leaving." They rode out of Bandera without another word. Back at the cabin, the silence felt suffocating. Maeve sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames. Elias tried to speak, but she only shook her head. That night, rain returned, gentle at first, then hard and cold. Elias woke with a start to find the bedroll empty. He ran outside to discover her at the river's edge, standing barefoot on a slick stone, dress clinging to her legs, hair soaked, eyes distant. "Maeve," he called. She didn't turn. "I can't exist like this. They look at me and see only that word. That brand, not a person, just something damaged." "You are not damaged," Elias said, stepping carefully toward her. "You survived." She shook her head. "You deserve someone whole. I want you," he said, voice shaking, "and I won't let you vanish." He reached out just as she stepped forward and caught her. The river surged mere inches below. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as rain soaked them both. She clung to him, sobbing against his chest, and he said nothing, just held her as long as she needed in the darkness, with only the storm as witness. Maeve didn't fall. She was held. The next time Elias rode into Bandera, he came alone. Maeve had refused to return, and he hadn't pressed her. After the previous incident, he'd never risk her safety again. But supplies were running low, and part of him needed to see if the town had changed or if it ever could. The journey was peaceful. Texas spring air clung warm to his coat, and Rufus' hoofbeats echoed through empty scrubland. But the closer they came to town, the heavier his breathing became. He tied Rufus outside the general store, tipped his hat to the clerk, and handed over Maeve's written list. The man nodded and disappeared to gather the goods. Needing a moment to clear the dust and bile from his throat, Elias stepped into the adjacent saloon. The room fell silent like a church in mourning. Men stared over half-empty cups. A poker game froze mid-hand. Somewhere near the hearth, a piano player stopped mid-note. War had ended, but suspicion hadn't, not for a man like Elias Gray. He stepped toward the bar, about to order coffee, when he saw him. Behind the counter, leaning with the swagger of someone too certain of their place, stood a broad-shouldered man graying at the temples. A long scar dragged from temple to jaw like a signature left by sin, and on his chest, pinned high and gleaming, was a tin star. Jonah Beeksley. Elias froze mid-step. His hands tensed, shoulders straightened. He hadn't seen that face in over 2 years, but he'd never forget it. Beeksley's eyes found him. For a moment, recognition didn't register. Then it did, flaring like gunpowder. His mouth curled. Well, he drawled. "If it ain't Elias Gray." Elias didn't move. His voice was gravel. "Didn't know Vermin got promoted to lawman." Beeksley laughed slow and cruel. He poured himself a drink, calm as a cat with blood on its paws. "You look different without the gray uniform," he said. "But I never forget the man who destroyed my quarters." Elias stepped forward, his boots echoing like war drums. "You ran a torture chamber for women, not a camp, not a post, a goddamn slaughterhouse." Beeksley's eyes glinted. "Slaves were property. Let's not revise history." Fury flared in Elias's chest. "You think branding women makes you powerful?" Beeksley leaned in, his smile widening. "Still playing savior? Or did you finally find yourself a pet?" Elias said nothing. Beeksley's eyes narrowed, voice turning ice cold. "Heard a girl's been hiding in the woods. Mark on her thigh, fire in her eyes. That wouldn't be my runaway, would it?" The air grew thin. Every man in the saloon watched now, waiting. Elias's hand rested near his holster. "She's not yours," he said, quiet as a death knell. "She was never yours. She was marked." Beeksley spat. "That makes her mine." Elias took one step closer. "You show up near that land again, and I'll bury you where you stand." Beeksley leaned forward, the badge on his chest catching light. "I'm the law here, boy. You shoot me, you hang." Elias didn't blink. "No, Beeksley, you're just a coward with a star." A beat passed. Then Beeksley hissed, "If you don't kill me now, one day you'll turn around and find her gone, because I always collect what's mine." Elias stared at him, fists tight. The room held its breath. Then slowly, Elias turned and walked out, rage burning in his chest like wildfire. One thing was clear. The war wasn't over. Maeve was still being hunted, and the hunter now wore a badge. The wind shifted that night, cold and sharp, cutting through the trees like a warning. Elias had gone out alone to check the snares near the ridge. Maeve had asked to accompany him, but he'd refused gently. "Stay warm. I won't be long," he'd said with a soft smile, but something about the way the air pressed against his back felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. He never reached the traps. The first blow came from behind, hard and fast, cracking against his skull. He hit the dirt, ears ringing, vision spinning. 3 men surrounded him, faces half covered in kerchiefs, but Elias knew who'd sent them. One of them spat tobacco near his head. "Where is she?" the tallest demanded. "Where's the branded whore?" Elias tried to rise, but a boot slammed into his ribs, sending lightning through his side. He bit down hard, blood filling his mouth. "We know she's with you, Gray. Beaksley's got a bounty on her head." A high one. Another kick, this time to his shoulder. Elias laughed, sharp and hoarse. "That why you came 3 on 1? For a girl half? Your weight?" The biggest one grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a tree trunk. "We came to give you a choice. Tell us where she is, or we leave you for the buzzards." Elias looked him square in the eye, pain slicing through every breath. "You kill me," he rasped, "and you'll never find her." The man punched him, and something cracked in Elias's side. He groaned, sharp and guttural. The second man raised a length of wood and brought it down across his ribs again. The world tilted, but he never spoke. When they finally left him broken, bleeding, breath wheezing through cracked ribs, they took his boots and left him barefoot in the dirt, hoping the cold would finish what their fists had started. He lay there curled around the pain, coughing blood, eyes barely open. The stars swam above him, and then, "Elias," her voice cut through the trees, desperate, afraid. "Elias." Maeve crashed through the brush, breath ragged, face pale with panic. She dropped to her knees beside him. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She touched his face, his chest, his shirt soaked with blood. "You're hurt." "Oh God, I'm fine," he croaked, barely audible. "Just a bit bruised." "Liar," she snapped, trying to lift him. "What happened?" "Beaksley's men? They wanted you." She pressed a trembling hand to his side, felt the heat swelling beneath the skin. Her face crumpled. "Your ribs," he coughed, tried to laugh. "Only a few. Nothing vital. Why didn't you run?" He looked at her through half-closed eyes, and even through the pain, he managed to smile. "Because if they'd touched you," he said slowly, "I wouldn't be able to live with myself." She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "Stupid," she whispered. "So damn stupid. I know." She slipped his arm over her shoulder and began dragging him toward the cabin. Every step was agony. Elias gritted his teeth, tried not to groan. Blood stained the ground behind them. "You shouldn't see me like this," he said once. "Halfway there, too." "Late," she answered. By the time they reached the cabin, she was soaked in sweat and shaking. She lowered him onto the bedroll, hands never leaving his body. She peeled back his shirt and hissed at the bruises, dark and spreading like ink under parchment. "Stay still," she commanded. "Do not move." He nodded faintly, breath shallow. As she pressed a cool cloth to his side, he whispered, "As long as you're safe, it was worth it." She froze. Their eyes met. He was half broken, bloodied, gasping for breath. But not once had he thought of himself. She sat beside him through the night, holding his hand in silence. And for the first time since she'd met him, Maeve began to believe that not all men took. Some stayed, some bled, and some loved without needing to say the word. The forest was still that morning to still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Maeve had risen early to fetch water from the creek, Elias still sleeping under the weight of healing ribs. She was halfway back when she saw it, the front door swinging open, the bedroll inside empty. No sign of struggle, no sound, just gone. Her heart plummeted. The world tilted, then something caught her eye. Bootprints, fresh, pressed deep into the mud from the previous night's rain. At least 3 sets heading west into the trees. She dropped the water pail, sprinted inside, and grabbed the rifle leaning beside the hearth. Elias's revolver sat untouched on the table, half cleaned from the night before. She took it too, checked the chamber. 4 bullets. Poor odds. She followed the trail into the trees, bare branches scraping her arms, breath sharp and fast. The prints grew fresher, more disturbed, with drag marks. Her pace quickened. An hour passed then too. Finally, she heard it, a voice, low and mocking, carried through the clearing ahead. "Jonah Beaksley." She crouched behind a tree, peering through the brush. Elias was on his knees, hands bound behind him, blood trickling from his temple. Beaksley paced in front of him, shotgun held low. 2 other men stood nearby, armed. "You think hiding her makes you noble?" Beaksley spat. "She's marked property, nothing more. You really think she won't flee the moment she sees you limping and broken like the rest of us?" Elias said nothing, chin lifted despite the bruises. Beaksley sneered. Hell, I should thank you saving me the trouble of tracking her down. Maybe I'll let you watch before I slit your throat. Maeve stepped into the clearing. Take one more step toward him, she said, voice clear, and I will end you. The men spun around. There she stood, hair wild, dress torn at the sleeves, mud on her boots, but eyes steady, gun raised, a breath from firing. Beaksley's grin faltered, then returned crueler than before. Well, now, he drawled. Ain't this something? The branded horse shows her teeth. He stepped forward. She didn't flinch. You going to shoot me, sweetheart? After all we've been through? His voice dropped to a snarl. You remember it, don't you? The cell, the ropes, the way you cried when the crack of the pistol shattered the morning. One shot straight into his chest. Beaksley staggered, blood blooming across his vest. He looked down in disbelief, then fell backward into the dirt. The other men froze. One turned to run. The other dropped his weapon and backed away with trembling hands. Maeve kept the gun raised until she was sure they were gone. Then she dropped it. Her knees gave out and she collapsed beside Elias, hands shaking violently. I killed him, she whispered, staring at the blood. I killed someone. Elias leaned toward her, even with pain in every breath. You saved my life. She shook her head, eyes wild. But what does that make me? What does it mean if I could do it? If I could pull the trigger like that? He reached for her, bound hands brushing her cheek. It means you are stronger than what he did to you. She stared at him, eyes filling. You're not afraid of me now? He held her gaze. I have never been less afraid. A sob escaped her lips. I thought if you saw me like that, you'd see what he saw. Elias leaned close, whispering through pain. I don't see what he saw. I see the woman who came for me. The woman who walked through hell and stood up to the devil. She lowered her head, pressing it to his shoulder, shaking with relief. I thought I had lost you. You found me. It was only then that she reached behind him, cut the ropes, and pulled him into her arms. They stayed like that for a long time, surrounded by silence and fallen leaves. Maeve had pulled the trigger, but for the first time, it wasn't in fear. It was in love and survival, and she wasn't sorry. The forge behind the cabin was nothing more than a blackened stone pit and an old anvil Elias had hauled up the ridge with a busted wagon wheel and sheer stubborn will. There was no shelter from the wind, no roof above, just open sky and the steady hiss of hot metal meeting cold air. But it was enough. He stood there at dawn, sleeves rolled, shirt soaked with sweat despite the morning chill, hammer gripped in calloused hands. Every strike echoed through the clearing like a slow heartbeat, the sound bouncing off the trees, waking birds and stirring something deeper. Maeve stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in one of Elias's old coats, arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't ask what he was making, not with words, but her eyes stayed fixed on him, watching, listening, waiting. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved like a man shaping more than just metal, like he was trying to shape meaning from ruin, trying to craft something that could last. The bullet casing had been in his satchel since the last day of the war. One of the final rounds he'd chambered in the chaos of fire and smoke. He had never fired it. Something had stopped him, maybe fate, maybe grace. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe it reminded him of what he'd survived. Or maybe it had always been waiting for this. He placed it gently in the fire until it glowed red hot, then pulled it out with iron tongs, laying it across the anvil. The first strike flattened it with a metallic cry. The next shaped it, then again and again. He moved slowly, methodically, turning the shell from a weapon into a ring rough-edged, golden from the brass, warm from the fire. When it cooled, he filed it smooth, polished it with a piece of cloth and ash. No engraving, no stone, just the memory of heat and the promise of what came after. By the time he finished, the sun had risen high over the pines. The air smelled of wildflowers and morning earth. Elias wiped his brow, pocketed the ring, and turned to face the open field. Maeve, he called softly. She stepped out, coat still wrapped around her shoulders, hair loose and tangled in the wind. He was standing near the edge of the trees where the field gave way to tall grass and bursts of color: bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, wild mustard stretching for miles. Spring had finally come to Texas. She walked to him, bare feet brushing through dew-kissed blades. He didn't wait. He met her gaze, steady and sure, no fear in his voice. I was never supposed to make it out of that war, Elias said. And after it ended, I didn't think there was anything left for me. I was walking through the world like a ghost. Maeve's throat tightened. But I found you, he said. Or maybe you found me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. It glinted faintly in the sunlight, modest, unpolished, forged by hand and memory. "This was a bullet once," he said, voice thick. "Now it's a promise." He dropped to one knee. "Maeve Carter, I know what they did to you. I know what they tried to take. But they didn't take your fire or your grace or your soul." He looked up, eyes shining. "You gave me a reason to live again, to fight for something real. Will you marry me? Will you build something with me that the war couldn't destroy?" Maeve stood motionless. Her fingers trembled. She looked down at her hands, still scarred, down at her leg where the brand still lingered. Then she looked at Elias. He wasn't looking at her scars. He was looking at her, the woman who had chosen to survive, to stay, to love. Tears filled her eyes. She smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Elias slid the ring onto her finger. It was imperfect, forged from ruin, but it fit as if it had always been meant to. She cupped his face in her hands, and when she kissed him, it wasn't just love. It was survival. It was salvation. And in that field of wildflowers under the wide Texas sky, they both knew they had taken what was meant to destroy them and turned it into something sacred. The sunset bathed the Texas hills in golden rose, casting long shadows across the small wooden chapel on the ridge. The day's heat had softened into gentle warmth, the kind that touched your skin like a memory. The air smelled of honeysuckle and dust, the wind whispering through the grass like it too had come to witness something sacred. Inside the chapel, the pews were filled with townspeople, quiet, curious, uncertain. Word of the wedding had spread like wildfire. They knew her name now. They knew the mark she bore. They whispered of the scar, of the soldier who had taken her in, of the nights she had been seen buying bread alone, head bowed, of the morning she had walked out of the doctor's office holding Elias's hand. Some came to judge, others came out of guilt for all the times they had looked away. But most came for the story, the girl who was branded and the man who never let her go. Candles flickered in the corners. Miss Alberta, the seamstress, sat in the front row, clutching a small handkerchief she'd sewn herself, and then the doors creaked open. Maeve stepped through. She wore a simple white dress, hand-stitched by Elias with clumsy fingers, every seam tugged and redone until it fit. Miss Alberta had helped him with the sleeves, adding soft lace borrowed from an old christening gown. The hem wasn't perfect, a stitch here, a loose thread there, but it was beautiful in the way only something earned could be. Her hair was pinned back with wildflowers, bluebonnets, Queen Anne's lace, and a sprig of lavender behind her ear. Her eyes, once darting and guarded, now held stillness, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone who had made peace with being seen. Her walk was steady, back straight, shoulders proud. The scar on her thigh showed beneath the slit of the dress. She let it. She did not hide it, and no one in that chapel looked away. A little girl scattered petals at her feet, laughing with delight. She didn't know the weight of what she was honoring, but somehow she carried it all the same. The room held its breath. Then someone clapped a single pair of hands, then another and another, until the room swelled with applause. Not for beauty, but for bravery. Elias stood at the altar, clean-shaven for the first time in months. His shirt was freshly pressed, his boots polished. His ribs still ached with every breath, but he stood tall. He had never looked more like a soldier and less like a man at war. His eyes never left her. When Maeve reached him, she smiled. "You did this," she whispered, barely audible. "So did you," he answered, just as quiet. The preacher began the ceremony, voice steady. But for most, his words blurred beneath the hush of hearts being rearranged. When it came time for vows, Elias took Maeve's hands in his and turned to face the crowd. "I want you all to see her," he said. "Not the mark, not the pain, not the past." He looked back at Maeve, his voice steady and sure. "She is not the girl they tried to break. She is not the thing they tried to brand. She is the woman who survived, and she is not someone's property. She is someone's hope." Then gently, he slipped the brass ring onto her finger. It was imperfect, shaped from an old bullet casing, but it was hers, forged from fire, from choice, from love. Maeve blinked back tears. Her lips parted, but words failed her. There was no need for words, only breath, only love. When the preacher gave them permission, Elias kissed her slowly, carefully, reverently, and the chapel erupted. Cheers, applause, quiet tears. Whispers filled the air. Maybe Grace still lived in Texas. They walked out hand in hand into the light of the setting sun, her dress catching the breeze, the scar visible like a flag never lowered. Outlaws may have once ridden these hills, but that day it was a different kind of legend being written. Later that night, beneath a sky full of stars, as the fire crackled low and the embers glowed like tiny suns, Maeve sat beside Elias. She stared into the flames. "I was branded as something broken," she said quietly. "Something used." She looked at